Joined right now by New Hampshire Senator Judd Gregg for now. He's the ranking member on the Senate Budget Committee. Where are we at? I watched you, by the way, like everybody on CSAN this morning, and this was your last markup, they were saying, and they congratulated you both sides. Where are we at now when as you see, you displayed that graph for us when it comes to reducing the deficit in our spending ratio? It's kind of ugly, isn't it?
Oh, it's worse than ugly. It's disastrous. We're looking at a lot more spending, a lot more deficits, a lot more debt, and we're guaranteeing that our kids are going to have a lot less prosperity. The simple fact is that we are on a path to, within 5 years, having junk bond status for the United States Treasuries, because we're going to run the debt up so high that essentially our debt will be downgraded. You're talking about doubling the national debt in 5 years, tripling it in 10 years. There's absolutely no fiscal discipline in this budget at all. I mean, it's just an outrage for anybody to represent that it has any fiscal discipline. There's no restraint. The entire cut in this budget is $4 billion. $4 billion on a budget that's $3 trillion next year. I mean, it's just absurd. And this Congress is on a spending binge, and it's just running our country right into the ditch, and it's taking our kids with it.
You know, I watched you, Senator, and no one disputed your graph towards the end to say where we're heading for the next generation, but they seem to dispute what you're doing now. Essentially, are they factoring in, or Democrats factoring in the fact that we were in this 2008, our economy was going to hit the side of a mountain, so we had to put all that spending into place, and we're just going to eventually correct it? We're going to need, in your mind, we're going to need a massive change, aren't we?
Well, of course we are. I mean, if you look at their own budgets, they're talking about an average deficit of $1 trillion every year for the next 10 years. They're talking about taking the public debt from 35% of GDP, which is manageable, up to 100% of GDP, which basically means we'll be like Greece. I mean, right. We're on this path. There's no way off this path unless you control the rate of growth of spending. It is not a revenue issue. Now, I heard today the president say he might entertain a value-added tax. Right. Well, that's an outrageous idea. I mean, this isn't a revenue issue. This is a spending issue. The size of the federal government under this administration has gone from 20% of GDP to 25% of GDP. Right. It's headed towards 30% of GDP. Our revenues are going to be back to 20% of GDP, which is above the historic norm since World War II. Right. So this isn't a revenue issue, it's a spending issue. Right.
Well, it's responsible talk like that. It's sad you're retiring. But let's talk about what's happening here in New York at Cooper Union. The president's going to talk about reforming Wall Street, the biggest change since 1930. It's in committee right now, in a committee you're a part of. So tell me, what would it take for you to get aboard with the president's proposals?
Well, I'd like to see a package which was bipartisan, number one. I'd like to see an end to too big to fail as a policy. I don't think taxpayers should have to stand behind banks that go do a bad job and get in trouble. I think that that should not be an issue. I would also like to see a derivatives proposal that is actually going to make derivatives safer and sounder while not pushing our whole entire derivatives market offshore.
$50 billion as a fund to break down failed banks. Does that have to be out for you and other Republicans to come aboard?
It doesn't have to be out for me to come aboard, but it has to be protected from the Congress spending it on something else. You know, whenever the Congress sees a pot of money, they usually go at, there's a tendency to go after it and spend it on whatever the local social justice issue is of the day. And if we're going to set up that type of fund to basically protect the taxpayers from having to come in to back up banks, that fund ought to be protected from the Congress, which is the real problem to begin with.
Right. Senator, it looks like by all accounts, it looks like we are going to head for some bipartisan agreement, and it'll be the president's second major legislative victory. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, Senator Gregg.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
Coming up straight ahead.